I hadn't expected to feel this way, not after everything. My marriage to James had been solid, for the most part. We had built a life together, good jobs, a nice house, a comfortable routine. But somewhere in the monotony, something shifted. Maybe it was the years of late-night work meetings, or the way he'd started coming home later and later, but I found myself growing distant, disconnected. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment I stopped feeling truly close to him, but the space between us felt unbridgeable. That's when David reappeared. I had always thought about him, especially when things with James weren't exactly fulfilling. David had been my first love, the kind of love you never forget. He was intense, passionate, and full of life. Back then, I was young, reckless, and craving something real. But life had moved on, and we went our separate ways. Until now. It started with a simple message. A "how are you?" that I hadn't expected to shake me. I thought about ignoring it. I really did. But the moment I opened that thread, something inside me stirred. David. After all these years. And what began as innocent catching up soon spiraled into something more dangerous. It felt wrong, but it also felt thrilling, like I was finally alive again. I started messaging him more, and before long, he was texting me every chance he got. We reminisced about old times, about our hopes and dreams, and about how our paths had diverged over the years. But with each message, the more I realized how much I had missed him, how much I had missed the feeling of being truly seen by someone. The more I remembered, the more I longed for those days. And then, we agreed to meet. The first time, I told James the first was going out with friends. He didn't ask any questions, as usual. He was always busy with work, and I had grown used to him not questioning my whereabouts. I told David to come over when James was at work. The idea of seeing him again filled me with a mix of excitement and guilt, but I couldn't stop. The thought of his presence, of being close to him, was irresistible. I remember the moment I sent that text, "Drop by, he's at work." My hands shook as I hit send, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. When he arrived, it was as if nothing had changed. His smile was the same, his eyes filled with the same warmth that I had once fallen in love with. And I felt that old connection flood back, taking over every part of me. It was electric, undeniable. We talked for a while, catching up, but the conversation quickly became less about the past and more about what was happening between us in that moment. I couldn't help myself. The chemistry was undeniable, and when his hand brushed mine, it felt like everything else had faded away. We kissed, and it felt like everything I had been missing in my marriage was suddenly right there in front of me. It was supposed to be a one-time thing. It wasn't meant to go any further. But as the days passed, I found myself reaching out to David again. And again. Each time, it was like a drug I couldn't quit. I felt terrible, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. The secret meetings became routine. Each time James left for work, I knew David would be there waiting for me. We kept things hidden. I wasn't prepared to face the reality of what I was doing. I couldn't. The thought of losing James, of destroying everything I had worked for, terrified me. But with David, I felt desired in a way I hadn't in so long. It was like I was rediscovering parts of myself I had forgotten. And the more I saw David, the more I realized how deeply I had missed him. There was always a little voice inside me, nagging at me to stop, to think about the consequences. But every time I looked into David's eyes, that voice faded into the background. It was just me and him, and everything else felt far away. But then came the day that changed everything. James came home early. I hadn't expected him to return until late that evening, but when I heard the door open, my heart stopped. Panic flooded my chest, and before I could even process it, I heard him calling my name from the hallway. I froze. My first instinct was to hide, but I knew it was too late. I couldn't think, couldn't move. David was still in the living room, standing awkwardly, trying to find a way to disappear. Anna? James's voice sounded so far away, like a distant echo. I grabbed for my phone, my mind racing. Should I lie? Should I pretend? But before I could form a coherent thought, James stepped into the room. His eyes swept over me, then landed on David. I saw the recognition flicker in his eyes before his face froze, the color draining from his cheeks. It took him a moment to speak, and when he did, his voice was calm, too calm. "What is this?" he asked, his gaze flicking between me and David. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even breathe. David shifted, looking guilty and uncomfortable, but he didn't move. I knew he was waiting for me to explain, but I didn't have an answer. How could I explain this? How could I justify betraying the man I had vowed to spend my life with? I could feel the weight of James's gaze on me, a silent accusation that seemed to pierce through every defense I had built. James stared at me, his jaw tightening. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, the words slipping out in a whisper of disbelief. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What could I say? How could I explain this mess? David cleared his throat, but the tension in the room was unbearable. I'm sorry, he said, stepping back. I shouldn't have, but James held up a hand, stopping him. No. You don't need to say anything. He turned to me, his eyes dark with hurt. I want to hear it from her. I couldn't look at him. The weight of his disappointment was suffocating. There was no excuse for what I had done, no words that could make it better. And just like that, everything shifted. My secret was out. I had never seen James so still before, so quiet. The silence that followed his question hung between us like a thick, suffocating fog. It wasn't the rage I had expected from him. It wasn't even the disbelief. It was something worse, an eerie calmness, like he was trying to comprehend the mess I had just made. I could see it in his eyes, how the trust we had built over the years was crumbling, piece by piece. I tried to speak, to explain myself, but the words were tangled in my throat. Everything sounded hollow. "I'm sorry," was all I could manage to mutter. It felt like the most inadequate thing I could say, but it was all that came out. David had taken a step back when James walked in, and now he seemed to shrink into himself, his presence suddenly awkward and unwelcome. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking like a child caught in a lie. The guilt on his face was apparent, but it wasn't enough to make me feel any better about the situation. We were both in this mess together. James didn't look at David anymore. His gaze was locked onto me, his eyes sharp, calculating. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. His words were clipped, precise, as if he were bracing himself for a bombshell. I swallowed hard. The truth was out now, but it wasn't just the affair that was breaking everything down. It was the fact that I had betrayed him in the one way I had sworn I never would. I had shattered the very core of our relationship. I had been selfish, and now I had to face the consequences. I could feel David's presence beside me, uncomfortable and uncertain, but I couldn't bring myself to care. James was looking at me like I was a stranger. There was a coldness in his eyes that I had never seen before. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely audible. "A few months. It wasn't supposed to happen." I stopped myself, realizing how weak and hollow my excuses sounded. James's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. His silence was worse than any outburst of anger. The weight of his disappointment was enough to suffocate me. "You don't know?" he repeated, his voice low but filled with so much emotion that it made my stomach churn. "You don't know how long this has been going on? How long you've been lying to me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but I had nothing left to say. What could I possibly say? The truth was right in front of him. There were no justifications, no explanations that could undo what I had done. David shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension in the room. "I think I should go," he said quietly. I didn't have the energy to stop him. James's eyes never left me as David made his way to the door. The click of the door behind him was like a finality, a closing chapter that I couldn't take back. The room felt empty now, even though James was still standing there, watching me, waiting for me to say something, anything, to make this better. But I couldn't. "Why?" James finally asked. His voice was steady now, but there was a hint of hurt that I couldn't ignore. "Why would you do this?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the loneliness I had been feeling, about the way David made me feel seen again, the way I had craved something I hadn't realized I was missing. But the words didn't come. There was no way to explain something that was so tangled up in guilt and selfishness. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know. I was lost, James. And I didn't know how to fix it. But I never wanted to hurt you." James let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "You think this doesn't hurt?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "You think I just go about my day, oblivious to the fact that my wife is having an affair with her ex?" I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I couldn't cry. I didn't deserve to. "I'm sorry," I whispered again, though it felt like the words were too small to express the depth of what I had done. James's face softened for a moment, but the anger didn't fade from his eyes. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Anna," he said quietly. "You're not the woman I married." The words hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't the affair, the lies, or the betrayal. It was that James didn't recognize me anymore. And I couldn't blame him. I didn't recognize myself either. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, shaking my head. "I never meant for it to get this far." He stepped back, putting some distance between us. The space between us felt like a chasm, wide and unbridgeable. "I think you need to leave," he said, his voice cold now. "I can't look at you right now." I felt a pang in my chest. I had pushed him away, and now I was being told to leave. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to do, what to say. But then I nodded, my heart heavy with regret. I didn't deserve to stay. "James, I'm sorry," I said one last time. But the words felt like empty air. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't look back. I didn't deserve to. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me, but it didn't help the ache in my chest. I had ruined everything. I had thrown away a marriage, a life, for a moment of selfish indulgence. And now, I didn't know how to fix it. The next few days felt like a slow, relentless unraveling of everything I had ever known. Each morning I woke up with the heaviness of what I had done, the guilt pressing on my chest, suffocating me before I even opened my eyes. I didn't hear from James. Not a call, not a message. Just the silence that had settled between us like a thick fog. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words, one that screamed with all the things left unsaid. I tried to busy myself with work, pretending that I could focus, but every glance at my phone, every notification, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I wondered if he was talking to anyone about what had happened. His sister, maybe? Or one of his friends? The thought made my stomach churn. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. The time had come to face the consequences of my actions. But the thought of confronting him, of looking into his eyes after everything I had done, terrified me. He hadn't even shouted at me. He hadn't cried or demanded answers. His silence was the worst punishment of all. On the fourth day, I finally couldn't take it any longer. I had to see him. I needed to know where we stood, even if the answer would be one I didn't want to hear. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, hovering over the screen before I typed a simple message, "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I hit send. I watched the little bubbles appear, then disappear, as if he was about to reply and then changed his mind. But then, after what seemed like a lifetime, my phone buzzed. I quickly grabbed it, nearly dropping it in my haste. The message read, "I'm at the house. We need to talk." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my jacket, my legs shaking beneath me, and headed for the door. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I drove to the house we once shared. It felt strange now, like a place that no longer belonged to me. The streets seemed unfamiliar, even though I had driven down them countless times before. I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen when I saw him again. When I arrived, I didn't even have the courage to knock. I let myself in, the door creaking as it opened. The house was quiet, eerily so. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. James was sitting on the couch, his back turned to me. He didn't move when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at first. The silence between us was suffocating. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, what to say. The weight of the last few days hung heavy in the air, and I could feel my own heart pounding in my chest. "James," I finally said, my voice soft, tentative. "We need to talk." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "What is there left to say?" he asked, his voice flat, emotionless. I winced at the coldness in his tone. This wasn't the James the first knew. The man I had married had been warm, loving, even when things were tough. But now? Now he was distant, like a stranger sitting across from me. I don't know where to start, I admitted, my voice breaking. "I've messed everything up, James. I don't know how to fix it. But I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you." His gaze never wavered from the floor, his fingers gripping the edge of the couch as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored. "I don't know if I believe that anymore," he said quietly. His voice was tight, like he was holding something back. "I don't know if I can ever believe you again." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had expected anger, maybe even tears, but this? This felt like the death of everything we had worked so hard for. "James, please," I said, my voice rising. "I don't know what came over me. It wasn't supposed to be this way." "It was just a mistake," he interrupted, finally turning to face me. His eyes were hard, narrowed, as if he were seeing right through me. "You don't get to call this a mistake, Anna. This was deliberate. This was something you chose. You chose him." The pain in his voice was almost unbearable, and it shattered what little composure I had left. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I whispered. "I swear, I didn't. But once it did, I didn't know how to stop it. I was lost, and I wanted to feel something again." James's expression softened for the briefest moment, but it was gone before I could fully register it. "You should have talked to me," he said. "You should have told me if something was wrong. Instead, you chose to lie. You chose to betray me. I know, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I should have. But I was scared, James. I was scared that you would stop loving me, that everything we had would fall apart. And I couldn't bear that. His jaw clenched, and I saw the struggle on his face. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again, he said, the words barely audible. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. I felt my chest tighten, the weight of his words crushing me. This wasn't the forgiveness I had hoped for, but I knew it was what I deserved. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I just need you to know that I am truly sorry. And I will do whatever it takes to make it right. If you'll let me. He didn't respond for a long time. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. I don't know what the future holds for us, Anna, he said, his voice steady but full of uncertainty. But I can't keep living in the past. I need time. We both need time. I nodded, unable to speak. The tears that I had been holding back for days finally began to fall, but I didn't try to stop them. James didn't say anything more as he walked past me, heading toward the door. I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. I had broken everything, and now, all I could do was wait. Wait for him to decide if there was anything left worth saving. The days stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. I spent them in a haze, not knowing where to go or what to do. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty, as if it had lost all its life the moment James had left. I tried to busy myself with trivial tasks, trying to hold on to something that could keep me grounded, but nothing worked. I missed him. I missed the sound of his voice, the way he used to laugh at my jokes, the way he'd hold me when I felt like the world was too much. But I also knew that I couldn't go back to the way things were. The guilt was eating me alive. I had betrayed his trust, broken the vows we'd made. And now, there was no easy fix. I had been selfish, and the weight of my actions was something I could never undo. It was late in the afternoon when my phone buzzed, pulling me out of my spiral of thoughts. I looked at the screen, seeing a message from him. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure how to feel. We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe in an hour. My heart skipped a beat. He had agreed to meet. It was the first step toward whatever would come next. But what did that mean? Was he willing to listen, or was he ready to end everything for good? I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my jacket, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the buttons. I couldn't afford to keep putting this off. I had to face him, even if it meant hearing the words I dreaded the most. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I had to go. The cafe was small, cozy, with dim lighting and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. It was the kind of place James and I used to visit when things were good, a little spot tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I stepped inside and scanned the room, my heart racing. There he was, sitting at a corner table, staring down at his coffee, his fingers wrapped tightly around the cup. When he saw me, he didn't smile, didn't stand up. He just nodded slightly, his eyes holding a quiet, unreadable intensity. "Hey," I said softly, taking a seat across from him. "Hey," he replied, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it, something that told me he was far from calm on the inside. I sat there, feeling the weight of the silence between us. I wanted to say so many things, but the words were trapped in my throat. What could I possibly say that would make this better? I had been so foolish, so blind to everything I had on the line. I had destroyed the trust we'd built, and now, I wasn't sure there was anything left to salvage. I've been thinking a lot, he said finally, breaking the silence. About everything. About us. His gaze never left mine, his eyes searching, studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. I've been thinking about it too, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how I got to this point, James. I don't know how to fix what I've broken. But I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to make it right. He leaned back in his chair, staring at me for a long moment. I could see the pain in his eyes, the frustration that he was struggling to suppress. He was still angry, still hurt, but there was something else there too. Maybe it was a glimmer of hope, something that hadn't completely died out yet. You've hurt me, Anna, he said, his voice low and controlled, but there was an edge to it. You don't get to just say I'm sorry and expect everything to go back to normal. It's not that simple. I know, I whispered, feeling the weight of his words like a slap to the face. I know it's not that simple. But I don't want to lose you, James. I don't want to lose us. He was silent for a moment, his eyes focused on the table as if he were trying to gather his thoughts. The tension in the air was thick, and I could barely breathe under the pressure. You say you don't want to lose us, he said, his tone quieter now, almost like he was talking to himself. But how can I trust you again, Anna? How can I believe that this isn't going to happen again? I didn't have an answer for him. How could I? The truth was, I didn't know if I could promise him that I wouldn't make the same mistake again. I didn't know if I could change who I was overnight. But I was willing to try. For him. For us. I can't change what I've done, I said, my voice shaking with the weight of it. But I can promise you that I will do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust. I'll prove to you that I'm not the person who hurt you. I'll work every single day to make it right. I know it's going to take time, and I understand if you need space. But please, don't give up on me. He looked at me, his gaze hard and unwavering, as if he was searching for something in my eyes. For a moment, I thought he might say that he was done, that there was no chance left for us. But instead, he said something I wasn't expecting. I don't know if I can forgive you, Anna, he said, his voice soft but firm. I don't know if I can ever get past this. But I'm willing to try. The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming in their intensity. I wasn't sure if I should feel relief or fear. I wasn't sure if there was a chance for us to fix things, but at least we were both willing to try. Thank you, I whispered, the tears welling up in my eyes. Thank you for giving me a chance. James didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, his face unreadable. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I wasn't sure where this would lead, or if there was a way back to what we had, but I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The road ahead would be difficult, full of uncertainty, but at least it was a road we could walk together. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for us after all. I ask everyone who likes our content to subscribe to the channel, it will help us a lot, and it will be a pleasure to have you here with us.